Well, let me thank all of you for your testimony today and also for your patience. I wanted to get a sense from maybe Brooks Rubin when the Obama administration was determined to ease sanctions, if you could talk about the benchmarks that they saw. In other words, we're going to back up a little bit, and this is what we expect to see from Khartoum. And then from Mr. Abubakar? Abubakar. You were describing what life is like with sanctions, and maybe you could pose some alternatives. If sanctions, if we continue along the direction we are, how do we get the regime to move?
I absolutely encourage re-engagement with Sudan. It's not something that I'm opposed to, essentially. I really don't think the comprehensive sanctions is the way to go, and that complete boycott is the way to induce any change. I do believe, though, in the modernized sanctions model put forward by the Enough Project could be a very effective way to go and re-engage with Sudan. I also believe when and if sanction relief is warranted, it should be completely human rights based, as that's, I think, in my opinion, the way to get to any other interest of the United States in the long term. Mm-hmm. Re-engaging right now on these sanctions, I'm afraid, will just leave the human of Sudan behind for the very long run, and I am afraid nothing will ever change should these sanctions be removed on these conditions.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks Rubin?
Thank you, Representative Bass, and I think that's, those are the issues that in some ways we would want to see in benchmarks for any comprehensive listing of sanctions is addressing exactly the issues that Mohammed and the other witnesses have testified to. I think the issues with the 5-track plan was that there weren't clearly established benchmarks. You had 5 tracks that were laid out, obviously on counterterrorism. That's something that is, unless the classified briefing is held that Mr. Detoni referred to for you, that's not something that anyone's going to have an insight into. As to the other tracks, the executive order says that progress needs to continue, but that's not defined. And in terms of understanding from the interagency what they're looking for, it's still an amorphous sense. So understanding what continued progress on cessation of hostilities or humanitarian access is leaves too much to the eye of the beholder. And this is a regime, and these are issues that cannot be subjectively evaluated in exchange for a much larger piece. If we had established sanctions relief that was measured, some small piece of the existing sanctions regime in exchange for some progress on these benchmarks, then there may have been a different discussion. But you ended up with limited pieces of the issues, mostly regionally focused, questionable progress on at least 2 of them in exchange for what is at least the entirety of the economic sanctions program administered by the Treasury Department. Without benchmarks, without clear steps that need to be met, it is impossible really for others to engage and really assess that well, which is, I think, why many are calling for this extension of, at least on the 5-track plan. But from our perspective, wherever that 5-track plan ends up, really what's important are the big peace human rights issues that all of us have focused on here. That needs a much different set of benchmarks and a much different set of pressures as a result.
Ambassador, you have a viewpoint on this?
I fully agree, as I said in the testimony, that what's missing in these benchmarks is the focus on some of the fundamental political issues, including and especially human rights, et cetera. And that has to be the focus of the next round of discussion. Because if you just only stuck with these, they're kind of holding positions, but they're not definitive. But then one has to define what those steps are. What are the steps that you think are both feasible and meaningful? And I think there are a number in terms of political space, of stop harassing civil society and arresting people and torturing them. There's a lot you can do in that area. It doesn't still answer the question of a political dialogue that ends the fundamental problems of the outlying areas, but one can make some very specific criteria in that area that at least starts to give space. And then one has to deal with both the some of the others. So I think that is the key to the next round, but it doesn't wait until we get to July. In other words, that should be already part of the dialogue that's going on now, so that regardless of how you come out in July, you already have an understanding and agreement as to where this is going next. If you don't have an understanding on that by the time you get to July, you haven't accomplished a great deal. And so I think that has to start now.
Mr. DeToni?
Well, Congressman Garrett said trust but verify. I mean, I can't believe, allow myself to trust. I mean, given the history, all the broken agreements that have occurred, I can't, allow, and I don't think we should have it as a policy to trust Khartoum in this current regime.
What do you think should be done?
Well, I do think we need to tie the sanctions conditionally. I think the Trump administration needs more time to get their personnel in. I think that they've been slow to put their people in, and the administration needs to own this.
So do you think they should put the sanctions back, the ones that were eased up?
No, we should extend the sanctions for 180 days or even a year, because yes, they have violated almost every agreement to a degree that they've made with the CPA. They did allow the South to vote to secede. But peace, there is a semblance of peace, and there is some hope, I think, in the two areas in particular. And I think that the new administration and the Congress needs to try to give this some life. There was almost, and Ambassador Lyman can speak, there was almost an agreement on humanitarian aid. The Obama administration pushed very hard for an agreement in the two areas for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And I think it was just too much too late. And I think that the people who would not agree with it saw a new administration on the horizon and said, we just got to wait and see, and we'll go with the new administration. So, give the administration some more time, find these areas, get their people in, the administration. They need to own it, because it's whatever happens in the region, it's on their watch now.
Mr. Brooks Rubin, I know in the Enough Project, and I think you made reference to, it's the Century, is that what it's called? And I wanted to know if you could speak about that in terms of assets that you think are offshore.
Thank you, Representative Bass. Yeah, the Century is an investigative initiative that the Enough Project and other partners have launched to get at the question of if we're going to launch, if we're going to use all of these policy tools, we need to have the intelligence behind it to know where those targets are and who they should be. So with respect to South Sudan, we've been able to document quite a lot of the properties of and corporate holdings of the officials that are leading to that crisis. And with respect to Sudan, the same. So there are properties and assets that we're investigating around the region, and in other regions. And we've looked extensively also at the banking network and trying to understand how, as I referenced in the testimony, how the government of Sudan, even during the sanctions, was able to establish banking relationships that allow that allow money to move and ultimately even move through New York through that system. So trying to understand where those banking nodes are will allow FinCEN at the Treasury Department and other financial intelligence units and banks to zero in on where that money is moving and how they can stop it. Even if the sanctions were to go away, in many cases what you're talking about are assets that are the proceeds of corruption. They are stolen from the people. As that money moves through the financial system, banks can still go after it. The financial intelligence units can go after it because it's money laundering. So we are, I guess the last thing I would say on the assets is looking extensively at gold. We have a report that we just issued yesterday called Sudan's Deep State. that looks at the gold sector, the weapons sector, the land sector, and looking at where these, how these sectors enable the regime and key leaders, key officials close to President Bashir, key entities I mentioned in my testimony, the NIS, an extensive corporate network that is enabling key members of the regime to move money around. That's where we can focus our tools. So with the centuries information provided to the relevant actors, the hope is then they can take and use these kinds of financial pressures we have used to get at other regimes. We need to be able to do that for Sudan. We need to be able to do that for the people of Sudan, to target those economic sectors and those actors and move away from this blunt instrument we had in the past. But you need the information for it. We saw with the century that there isn't a lot of the resources devoted to gathering this kind of financial intelligence around East and Central Africa. We the U.S. government, devoted to lots of other parts of the world. It's needed for East and Central Africa, and then the century was the ability to say, well, we can collect as much as we can, we'll turn that evidence over, and then hopefully use will be made of it.
Thank you. Let me ask you a number of questions and then take the ones you would like. Mr. Brooks, Ruben, you in your testimony pointed out that Sudan has used the provisional easing of the sanctions put in place in January not to begin the reforms, necessary reforms of structural deformities of the country's economy, but instead to order fighter jets and battle tanks from its traditional arms suppliers in Russia and China. And I would have a question, do you all agree with that? If you could elaborate on that. Let me just point out that with the Iran deal, which I thought was egregiously flawed on multiple fronts, including the procurement and development of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them in Iran, sanctions should have been allowed to stay in place far longer to get a deal that was verifiable and real, rather than allowing them minimally after 10 years to have an industrial state capacity to produce fissile material. Well, human rights were deliberately left out of that negotiation, and the same thing happened with North Korea. We had Andrew Natsios, our former USAID administrator and a man who wore many hats within previous administrations, and an expert who also heads up North Korea human rights organization, testify. And he said there too, in North Korea, human rights were just thrown under the bus, no comments, just work on the nuclear issue. And when that didn't materialize and no progress was made, matter of fact, just the opposite, they do have nuclear capabilities now, and they're ever perfecting the means to deliver them. Human rights were unaddressed. And now we have these 5 different mutually reinforcing areas where human rights are emphasized, to put it mildly.